Imagine sitting down to a quiet evening meal. There's no silverware, no clean plates. Your dinner is a dark slab of bread, tougher than leather, and a bowl of onion-flavored mush. No spices, no sugar, no comfort, just survival. Tonight, let's leave behind the glow of your modern kitchen and step into the smoky hearths of the Middle Ages. We'll explore what real people ate, how they cooked, and why medieval meals were, well, pretty nasty. So settle in, take a deep breath, and let your thoughts drift softly into the past. This is History for Sleep, and tonight's story is about food. You might picture a feast when you think of the Middle Ages. Roasted meats turning on a spit, long wooden tables stacked with pies, goblets of wine raised in celebration. But that was the exception, the fantasy, the preserved memory of the privileged few. The truth is quieter, harsher, hungrier. Most people in medieval Europe were peasants. They worked the land not because they chose to, but because they had no other option. They didn't dine for pleasure or variety. They ate to survive. And survival, in many cases, meant bread and little else. But not the kind of bread you know today. This bread was not soft, not golden, not warm and fluffy from the oven. It was thick, dense, heavy as a stone in the stomach, and just as difficult to digest. Made from rye, barley, or oats, whatever grains the land could yield, it was dark, rough, and often stale before the day was out. The crusts cracked like bark. The interiors could be so dry they needed to be dipped in weak broth or ale just to chew. On the worst days, when even grain ran short, the flour was stretched with what was available: ground tree bark, powdered roots, acorns, sometimes even chalk or clay. These were not flavorings. They were desperation disguised as dough. The poor adapted not out of creativity, but out of necessity. It was better to eat something than nothing, even if that something scraped your teeth and turned your stomach. This bread was the foundation of life in the countryside, baked in communal ovens or at home in clay hearths. And it wasn't always trusted. In lean years, mold grew on stored grain, and the result, once baked, could cause strange symptoms: convulsions, hallucinations, blackened limbs. Entire villages suffered from these so-called curses. We now know this was ergot poisoning, caused by a fungus that thrived in damp rye, but to them it was a mystery, a punishment, a plague sent by God or witches or the restless dead. Next to bread, there was often gruel, a word that sounds thin because it was. Gruel was the catch-all solution to medieval hunger. A watery porridge made by boiling oats, peas, or lentils until the mixture became something between a soup and a sludge. If the family had onions or leeks, they might toss a few slices in. If they were lucky, a spoonful of lard added fat and flavor. But more often, it was plain. It was pale. It was hot, and that was enough. In many homes, this gruel simmered day after day in a single iron pot over a fire that rarely went out. They called it pottage. It absorbed whatever the family had: a bit of vegetable, a leftover bone, a pinch of herb, one pot, one meal, again and again. The taste didn't matter. Fullness did. These meals were not served individually. There were no plates, no courses, no polished utensils. Families gathered around a single bowl or pot. They ate with fingers, or with spoons if they had them. Children learned quickly not to reach too far or take too much. Portions were unspoken, governed by instinct and order. Elders first, then adults, then children. Sometimes infants were fed pre-chewed bits from a mother's mouth. passed from one generation to the next in the most primal of rituals. And through it all, through the chewing of bark bread and the swallowing of pale broth, there was silence. Meals were often quiet, not out of reverence, but out of fatigue. After long days in the fields or in the woods gathering firewood or tending to sick animals, there was little energy left for talk. Food was not for joy. It was for endurance, a pause between burdens. In wealthier villages or monasteries, there might be communal eating halls. But even there, the fare was simple. A monk's table might include a boiled egg, a slice of hard cheese, and bread that was only marginally softer. Meat was rare and usually reserved for special feast days. Fish, often dried or salted, was more common, but still a luxury. And milk, while abundant in theory, was difficult to store. Without refrigeration, it spoiled quickly, and most of it was turned into butter or cheese to last longer. Seasonal rhythms controlled everything. In the spring, wild greens like nettle or sorrel added a brief burst of freshness to the pottage. In summer, there might be a few berries, gathered carefully before the birds got to them. Autumn meant dried beans, stored apples, maybe a handful of nuts. Winter was cruel. Roots were the only guarantee. Turnips, beets, and onions, if they hadn't already rotted. And always bread. Bread stretched and hardened and scraped clean of every crumb. Some families managed to keep chickens for eggs, or a pig that would be slaughtered before winter. But these animals were valuable. They were not meals, they were investments. Chickens laid eggs, pigs grew fat, goats gave milk. Killing them early meant losing weeks of use. It was a calculation every peasant had to make, and often the animals lived longer than the people. Feasting for the poor was rare, but it did happen. Weddings, holidays, harvest celebrations, these were the moments when the community came together. A cow might be slaughtered, ale brewed stronger, the bread baked fresh and clean, but such feasts were brief. And when the celebration ended, they returned to gruel, to bark, to hunger. Malnutrition was not an exception. It was the baseline. Children grew slowly, their bones thin and fragile, teeth rotted early from gritty flour, wounds healed slowly, diseases festered. A bad winter, a failed crop, a sudden illness. Any one of these could send a family into a spiral of hunger they might never climb out of. And yet, they endured. Through cold, through scarcity, through years of poor harvests and floods and wars, the peasant families of medieval Europe adapted. They found rhythm in the planting and harvesting of grain. They learned to preserve what little they had. They shared when they could, hoarded when they had to, and taught each generation how to make bread from nothing. There is a quiet kind of dignity in that, a strength forged not by choice, but by necessity. These were not people who lived to eat. They ate to live. And in that effort, in the baking of another dark loaf, in the boiling of another pot of gruel, in the passing of a spoon from hand to hand, they survived, not because the food was good, but because giving up wasn't an option. That was the peasant's table, and tomorrow they'd sit at it again. If bread was the body of the medieval peasant's diet, then meat was the ghost, present only in memory or imagination, visible at noble banquets, but vanishing in the daily reality of common folk. For most people living in the countryside, meat was not part of regular life. It was a visitor, an event, something that arrived with ceremony, not routine. You might taste it during a wedding, a harvest festival, a saint's feast day in the village square, or when a beloved animal grew too old to milk and necessity dictated its end. But day to day, the average man or woman might go weeks without a single bite of meat, even longer without anything fresh. Without refrigeration, meat was an immediate problem. It began to spoil within hours. In summer, it could rot in the time it took to walk it home from the market. So if meat was to be stored, it had to be preserved, salted, dried, smoked, buried, Hungarian pickled, anything to hold off the inevitable stink of decay. Salt was the most common tool, but it was also one of the most expensive. Unlike today, salt wasn't cheap or abundant. It was mined or harvested painstakingly from seawater in great pans that baked under the sun. Wars were fought over salt. Whole towns built fortunes from it. For peasants, it was something bought by the ounce and used with precision. When meat was salted, it became tough, chewy, almost leathery. It needed to be boiled sometimes for hours to become soft again. The result was still better than nothing, but it didn't taste like much, and it didn't taste like meat. Sometimes meat was smoked over low fires in smokehouses or chimneys. The smoke slowed down decay. It added flavor and sometimes masked the taste of spoilage. But the process took time and wood and care. In wealthier homes, meat was hung in cellars or pantries, dark, cool spaces lined with hooks and slabs. In monasteries, meat was preserved with herbs or soaked in vinegar. In castles, cooks had better tools, more salt, more space, more options. But for the poor, preservation was a gamble. If the salt failed, the food could rot unseen. If the weather turned, the smoke might not dry the flesh fast enough. If rats found the storage pit, the meat might disappear overnight. So when meat arrived, it was consumed with urgency. A pig slaughtered for winter had to be shared, preserved, or eaten quickly. Families called neighbors. Villagers gathered. Portions were handed out. Some of it became sausage. Some became salted cuts. Some was cooked right away and eaten with gratitude down to the last scrap. But even here, the best parts rarely went to the peasant. The rich claimed the haunches, the roastable joints, the belly fat. What remained were the less noble bits, the tongue, the liver, the kidneys, the feet, boiled bones, fried scraps, organs and entrails, ground and stuffed into casings. In many ways, these were the most practical parts. They could be stretched, stewed, preserved. Blood was caught and turned into pudding. Fat was rendered into lard. Intestines were cleaned and used as sausage skins. Nothing was wasted because nothing could be. And yet, there were times when even these remnants were unavailable. In years when harvests failed, when livestock died of disease, or when a village was cut off by war, famine took hold, and meat, already scarce, became fantasy. People scavenged for what they could find: a dead dog, a frozen crow, boiled leather from a shoe. Sometimes moss or weeds were boiled to make broth, sometimes nothing at all. In towns, famine meant riots. In the countryside, it meant disappearance. Families vanished, cottages stood empty, the dead went unburied. The lucky ones moved on, the unlucky remained and waited, and still there were meats to be had. But they were out of reach. In the forests that stretched beyond the fields and hedgerows, game flourished. Deer, boar, rabbit. The forests were alive with meat, but the peasants were forbidden. Forests did not belong to everyone. They were the property of the Lord, of the king, of the church. To enter them with a bow or trap was to risk everything. Poaching was a serious crime. It wasn't a slap on the wrist. It was the loss of a hand, a foot, a life. That didn't stop the hungry. At night, some crept into the woods with silent traps, with dogs trained to kill without barking, with nets or spears or bare hands. The meat was hidden in baskets of hay, in hollow logs, carried home under a cloak. If caught, the punishment was swift. A fine if you could pay. Imprisonment if you could not. Branding, maiming, in some cases, execution. It was not the animal that was valuable. It was the principle. The game belonged to the powerful, and the powerful did not share. So meat, for the poor, was not just a rarity, it was a risk. Even raising your own animals was a delicate thing. Chickens, goats, pigs, these were assets. Chickens laid eggs, and eggs were life. Goats gave milk, and milk became cheese. Pigs grew slowly, and when they were finally slaughtered, it was a season's event. To eat an animal early was to lose weeks of food it could still provide. So the balance was constant. A chicken only became stew when it stopped laying. A goat only vanished when its milk dried up. Slaughter meant smoke in the yard, blood on the ground, a flurry of activity as every usable part was processed. The meat had to be cooked or preserved quickly, and the tools were simple: a knife, a fire, a stone, a wooden bowl. There were no butchers for the poor. You were the butcher, and even if you succeeded in preserving the meat, the danger was not over. Spoiled food was a hidden killer. Rot did not always show itself. A stew that smelled fine might carry bacteria or fungus. A sausage dried too quickly might rot from within. And there was no second opinion, no refrigeration, no certainty. You ate or you went hungry. And so for most people in medieval Europe, meat remained distant, a memory of a better time, or a dream of a better life. It was the thing you described in bedtime stories, the thing nobles wasted at their tables while you scraped your bowl for crumbs. Yet when it came, it meant more than just nourishment. It meant luck. It meant occasion. It meant celebration, a wedding feast, a holy day, a miracle. Children remembered the taste of it for months. Neighbors spoke of it as if it had been magic. And when it was gone, they returned to bread, to gruel, to the long patient waiting for the next pig, or the next chance to try the woods just once more before the snow fell. Because even in hunger they hoped, even in danger they tried, because that's what survival looked like. After the last scraps of bread were eaten, and after the meat, if any, was cooked down to bones and fat, there remained the final, humble foundation of the medieval diet: vegetables. Not bright salads or fresh-picked delights, but boiled, muted offerings that fed the body with just enough to go on. But even here, there was doubt. In the medieval mind, food was not just about nutrition. It was about balance, about humors, about heat and cold, about what the body could digest safely. And raw vegetables, they were considered dangerous, cold, damp, indigestible, a threat to the health of anyone not strong enough to withstand them. The fear was not unfounded, at least not by their understanding. In a world without sanitation, without refrigeration, and without a germ theory of disease, the things that made people sick were mysteries. When someone fell ill after eating raw greens from the garden, it wasn't bacteria they blamed. It was the nature of the food itself. Perhaps it was too cold for the stomach. Perhaps it disrupted the body's inner balance. So nearly everything was cooked, boiled, stewed, sometimes baked, though rarely roasted. Vegetables were not served crisp or fresh. They were softened into mash, broken down into their simplest forms, often boiled until they lost both color and taste. Texture was not prized. Preservation was. Most peasants in the medieval countryside grew what they could near their homes. In tiny garden plots behind thatched cottages, they planted onions, leeks, garlic, cabbage, and occasionally herbs. These were hardy plants, able to survive poor soil, irregular weather, and long seasons. They were cheap, familiar, reliable. These plants, along with beans and lentils, became the foundation of most peasant meals. Cabbage was boiled until it wilted into ribbons. Onions were stewed with barley or buckwheat. Garlic flavored what little fat remained in the cooking pot. Leeks were chopped into the same soup every evening. Day after day, week after week, the pot stayed the same, even if its ingredients shifted slightly. Potatoes? They didn't exist in Europe. Tomatoes? Not until centuries later. Corn? Not a kernel. All three were native to the Americas, unknown in medieval Europe before the Columbian Exchange. So the great trio of modern staples had no place in medieval soil, no place on the medieval table. Instead, the peasant ate turnips. Turnips and more turnips, boiled, mashed, roasted, if firewood allowed. Radishes were eaten too, though usually cooked. Beets, in some regions. Carrots, though they were not orange, but purple or white. These vegetables filled the stomach, but rarely lifted the spirit. The repetition was immense. The average peasant might eat the same stew every day for a month, changing only what happened to be ripe or leftover. The phrase perpetual pottage described it well. A stew that never ended, just absorbed what was available. Sometimes it tasted of onion, sometimes of beans. Sometimes it barely tasted at all. Herbs helped. In a quiet way, they added character. Sage, parsley, thyme, wild nettle, grown in garden corners or gathered from hedgerows, they gave faint complexity to otherwise flat flavors. Nettle was especially useful, nutritious, plentiful, and softened easily when cooked. It was often added to gruel or boiled with barley to give it substance. But spices, real spices, were out of reach. Cinnamon, pepper, cloves, nutmeg, these existed in Europe, but only barely. They traveled thousands of miles from Asia, traded through long routes that passed through the hands of merchants, nobles, and princes. By the time they reached a market in London or Paris, their cost was staggering. A single handful of peppercorns could buy a goat. A small pouch of saffron might equal a month's wages. To own spices was to declare wealth. To cook with them openly was to show power. Nobles used spices with pride. Their kitchens smelled of cinnamon and cumin. Their meats were seasoned with sauces rich in imported flavors. Their breads sometimes contained ginger. Their stews gleamed with saffron threads. It wasn't just about taste. It was about prestige. For the poor, spice was a scent in the air during feast days. A story told by someone who had worked in the Lord's manor. A rumor carried from a market. The common man did not taste cinnamon. He imagined it. He didn't buy pepper. He envied it. Instead, he leaned on vinegar for flavor or mustard made from local seeds. Sourness was safer than sweetness. Salt was precious but could be used sparingly. Sometimes dried herbs helped. But for the most part, medieval cooking was simple, not in the refined sense, but in the restricted sense. It was what could be grown, stored, and cooked in one pot day after day. The seasonal cycle controlled everything. In spring, wild greens like dandelion leaves or sorrel added a brief bitterness. In summer, peas and beans grew plump, and fresh garlic was pulled from the earth. Autumn brought root vegetables and the drying of beans. Winter brought turnips, always turnips. Preservation was key. Vegetables were dried or salted. Cabbage could be fermented into sauerkraut. Beans were strung and hung to dry. Onions were braided and stored. Leeks were chopped and pickled in some regions. Waste was not an option. But even preserved, the food was limited, repetitive, gray. There was no rainbow on the medieval plate, no burst of flavor, no balance of sweet and sour, salty and umami. Meals were made to fill, not to excite. And yet within these limitations, there was rhythm, a certain comfort in predictability. The pot always bubbled, the stew always simmered. The smell of boiling cabbage, of garlic and leek, of barley thickening in the broth. These were the background sounds and scents of daily life. Children grew up with them, elders relied on them, and when a different scent drifted into the village, a noble's feast perhaps with lamb and saffron and roasted almonds, it stirred something. A hunger not of the body, but of the imagination. A longing to know what other lives tasted like. But for most, those flavors never came. They lived on what they had. Colorless meals, repetitive meals, and in those bowls of gruel, those endless stews, they found survival. Not joy, not satisfaction, but survival. Because in the end, the food of the medieval peasant was not about flavor. It was about getting through the day and then doing it all over again. In the Middle Ages, even something as simple as drinking water came with risk. Streams and rivers may have looked clean, but they were rarely safe. Waste from animals, runoff from nearby fields, refuse from villages, and in some cases, even sewage made its way into those very waters. Wells, though more protected, weren't always reliable either. The water might be brackish or tainted with minerals. A poorly lined well could carry disease, and there was no knowledge of microbes to warn people. Only the memory of sickness, of fevers that came and took people without explanation. So the solution, strangely enough, was alcohol. But not the alcohol we think of today. People drank ale, weak, cloudy, homemade beer. It was far from strong, and it wasn't consumed for the buzz. It was consumed for safety. The boiling of water during brewing killed many of the pathogens, and the fermentation process made it more stable. It was, in many ways, the safest liquid available, and so it became the drink of choice for adults, for the elderly, and yes, even for children. Ale was not a luxury, it was a necessity. It was brewed in small batches, often weekly, using barley or oats and whatever herbs could add flavor. It wasn't clear or carbonated. It had no head of foam. It was thick, slightly sour, sometimes warm from the fire, but it was nourishing, and it wouldn't kill you like bad water might. Households often had their own brew kettles. Women in particular managed this task. Brewing was seen as domestic labor, like baking or spinning wool. The alewife was a respected figure in many communities, responsible not just for drink, but for one of the only forms of guaranteed hydration. Brewing took time, care, and ingredients that were never wasted. Spilled grain, bad malt, or spoiled batches could mean days without safe drink. In some towns, surplus ale was sold to neighbors or to laborers. Taverns and alehouses became common gathering points, not because people wanted to get drunk, but because they needed to drink. Stronger ales and beers did exist, but those were often reserved for festivities or travelers with money to spend. Everyday ale was mild, often containing less alcohol than modern soft drinks. Wine was different. Wine belonged to the rich, to the lords, the monks, the merchants. It came from warmer climates, Italy, France, or the southern coast, and had to be shipped, taxed, and stored. In monasteries and noble estates, wine was consumed with every meal. In cities, it was available but costly. For the poor, it was rare, a gift, a glimpse into another world, something saved for holy days or never tasted at all. Cider, made from apples, was more accessible, but apples were seasonal. Fermentation required time and space. Cider came in waves, abundant in the fall, nearly gone by spring. It was enjoyed, even celebrated, but it couldn't be relied on like ale. So beer became the baseline of hydration. Weak ale for the children, mild ale for breakfast, slightly stronger for laborers after a long day. Drunkenness wasn't common at the peasant table. It was a sin in the eyes of the church, and most people couldn't afford enough to reach that state. But alcohol in small doses was a daily reality. Not indulgence, not escape, just survival. As the day ended and meals were scraped from wooden bowls and pots were cleaned with cloth or ash, the evening settled in. The medieval home was a simple place. One room, perhaps two. The hearth glowed with the last of the fire, offering light and heat. Smoke curled upward into the rafters, escaping slowly through a hole in the roof or a crooked chimney. There was no glass in the windows, only shutters. Cold wind crept in around every board. Walls were made of wattle and daub, sticks and mud, stiff in winter and soft in rain. The floor was often just earth, packed down by feet. With no central heating, warmth came from the fire, from layers of clothing, from the closeness of bodies. Families huddled together on straw-stuffed mattresses or woolen blankets. In some homes, livestock were kept inside overnight. A pig in the corner, chickens in a crate, adding warmth and security. The smell was strong, the sounds constant, but it was home. Bells from a distant monastery might toll the evening hour. A dog might bark. An owl might call from the edge of the woods. And inside, after a meal of boiled grain and cabbage, perhaps a sliver of meat if fortune smiled, the family settled into silence. Candles flickered. Not many. Tallow candles were expensive. A rushlight might burn. A strip of dried reed dipped in fat, just enough to see by. Shadows danced on the walls, long and slow. There was little to do after dark. Reading was rare. Books were treasures owned only by the church or the very wealthy. The fire became the focus. Stories were shared. Prayers whispered. The rhythm of the day faded into the hush of night. And if they were lucky, with their bellies warmed by stew and ale, they dreamed. Dreams of things they did not have. Dreams of things they had heard about, but never tasted. Sweet fruits from far-off lands, pies filled with spices, roasts carved in golden halls, foods that existed in noble kitchens and abbeys in the legends told by traveling minstrels. But even those dreams were shaped by reality. They did not expect abundance. They dreamed instead of enough. Enough bread to last the week. Enough warmth to sleep without shivering. Enough safety to wake in the morning and know the fire hadn't gone out. Because in the Middle Ages, food wasn't about satisfaction. It was about survival. It wasn't about delight. It was about durability. Each day was a small victory. Every meal, a kind of triumph. And sleep, when it came, was not rest earned through indulgence, but recovery earned through labor. They slept with the smell of boiled grain still in the air. They slept beneath patched wool, beneath thatch and smoke, beside animals and children and coals turning slowly to ash. Outside, The wind stirred the trees. Inside, the quiet deepened. No alarms, no screens, no noise beyond the wood shifting in the fire or the breath of someone close beside you. And still, beneath the harshness of life, there was a rhythm, a simplicity. A full belly, no matter how plain, was still a blessing. A warm hearth, no matter how smoky, was still a mercy. And a sleep, untroubled by hunger or fear, was more valuable than gold. Because in the Middle Ages, you didn't eat to celebrate the day, you ate to survive the night. And if you made it to morning, that was enough. And now, as your body relaxes and your mind floats gently through the candlelit kitchens of the past, remember, no matter what's in your fridge tonight, you're living in a golden age of flavor. Sleep well, dream deep, and thank your lucky stars. You weren't born hungry in the 1300s. This has been History for Sleep with Joe. Good night.